Well, imagine yourself in a quiet German town of Westerfeld. A sinister plot then was unfolding. A man driven by this insatiable desire had been secretly planning the ultimate taboo. And as the story unfolds, a shocking revelation awaits that will leave you questioning the depths of human depravity. Welcome to Mystery Files. Arwen Muse, a seemingly ordinary 52-year-old computer technician, had been living a life of solitude in his secluded farmhouse. And to the outside world, he appeared to be this quiet and unassuming individual. But beneath the surface, a dark obsession had been festering in himself for years. You see, in 2014, Muse began his search for a willing victim on the internet. You see, he frequented these cannibalism forums and websites and seeking someone who shared his twisted desires. And astonishingly, he found a volunteer, a 27-year-old man who had agreed to be killed and then eaten. Clearly, Muse was enthralled by this information, so he meticulously planned the encounter, preparing his farmhouse for the gruesome ritual. And when the day finally arrived, the volunteer traveled to Muse's home, ready to fulfill their macabre agreement. And as the two men cordially just sat down for their last meal together, this kind of eerie calm went all around the house. And Muse had prepared a special dinner. But little did the guests know that he was to be the main course. Now, what transpired next, I cannot tell you about because it is a shocking act of cannibalism. I mean, Muse, and I'll try to keep this brief, but he killed his victim and began the process of dismembering and consuming the body. And the scene was literally straight out of a horror movie, with Muse meticulously carrying out his plan at every step. However, the authorities, though, were already on his trail. You see, Muse had left a digital footprint, and the police were able to, track him down through his online activity. And soon enough, they raided his farmhouse, where they found the grisly remains of his victim. Muse, of course, was arrested and then charged with murder. But during the trial, he claimed that the act was consensual, and that he had only been fulfilling his victim's desires and hopes. However, the court, as any reasonable one would do, disagreed and found him guilty, sentencing him to life in prison. And the case shocked the nation. All around the world, headlines were made. People were left wondering what could drive a seemingly normal person to commit such a heinous act. You see, psychologists and criminologists studied Muse, trying to understand the roots of his cannibalistic urges. But, and this is when it gets crazy, as the investigation into Muse deepened, a startling revelation came to light. Okay, I hope you're ready for this, because this was not the first time Muse had killed and eaten someone. In fact, not even the first time he was caught. He had committed a similar crime back in 2001. You see, 13 years earlier, Muse had found another willing victim online. The man, Bernd Jürgen Amander Brandes, had agreed to be killed and then eaten. And Muse had back then carried out the act in a very similar fashion, dismembering and consuming Brandes' body over several months. And believe it or not, the authorities actually caught wind of this crime back then, and Muse was arrested in December 2002. And once again, during his trial, this time for the first time, he claimed that the act was a fulfillment of Brandes' desires and that he had only been a helper in the act. Shockingly, the court initially convicted Muse of manslaughter and only sentenced him to 8 years in prison. But the lenient sentence caused a huge uproar, and prosecutors appealed that decision. Then, finally, in a retrial, Muse was found guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. But obviously not, right? If he went to do it again? And this revelation that Muse was a repeat offender sent shockwaves through the community. People were left wondering how he could have been released after his first time, only to kill again. I mean, remember, this case of Arwen Muse serves as a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk within the human psyche. And it also raises concerning questions about consent, the boundaries of law, and the responsibility of society to protect its members from those who would do them harm. And as Muse served out his second life sentence, the memory of his crimes continue to haunt the nation. The case has become a cautionary tale, a warning of the dangers that can lurk in the shadows of the internet and the depths of depravity that humans can do. That story was to get you all jumped up and boiling, because this one also has a crazy ending, but definitely a different story. You're gonna enjoy this one. In the sweltering hot summer of 1912, the Dunbars, a well-to-do family in Opelousas, Louisiana, I hope I said that right, embarked on a fishing trip to Swayze Lake. Yes, like Patrick Swayze. And Percy and Leslie Dunbar, along with their two sons, Bobby, who was age 4, and Alonzo, who was age 8, were looking forward to this relaxing getaway and just had a great time imagining what they would do there. But little did they know that this trip would mark the beginning of a mystery that would haunt them specifically for decades. Now, believe me, I know people say this a lot in their videos, acting like there's going to be some mysterious reveal at the end by saying, hey, you really need to stick around to the end on this one. And as cliche as it might be, I'm going to sit here, look you right in the eye, and tell you, you better stick around for the ending of this one, or you're going to miss something huge. Okay, so on August 23rd, shortly after arriving at Swayze Lake, Bobby all of a sudden vanished without a trace. The backstory is the family had been preparing for a picnic when they noticed that their young boy was nowhere to be seen. So immediately panic-stricken, Percy and Leslie searched frantically for their son, combing the dense woods and calling out his name, but of course to no avail. And as night slowly fell, their worst fears began to take hold. Something terrible had happened to their beloved Bobby. Clearly, at this point, the Dunbars immediately contacted the authorities, and a massive search party was formed. I mean, hundreds of these volunteers, including local residents and law enforcement officers, scoured the area around Swayze Lake. And they even had to dredge up these murky waters, hoping that Bobby did not drown. And as these excruciating days that I'm sure would be every parent's worst nightmare turned into weeks, and the search expanded to neighboring towns and parishes, but there was still no sign of the missing child. In fact, even months passed by, and the Dunbars' desperation as well grew. They offered a substantial reward for any information leading to Bobby's safe return. And the case generated national attention. I mean, newspapers all across the country ran stories about the missing boy, and the Dunbars received countless letters of support and encouragement. And despite the outpouring of sympathy, however, there were no solid leads, and hope eventually began to fade. But then, an entire 8 months after Bobby's disappearance, a glimmer of hope emerged. You see, in April 1913, way before, digital cameras and we can track them and this and that, a traveling handyman named William Cantwell Walters was found with this young boy who bore a striking resemblance to Bobby Dunbar. But this boy, who Walters claimed was his nephew, named Bruce Anderson, was discovered in Mississippi, which was over 100 miles from where Bobby had vanished. But at this point, the Dunbars, just, desperate for answers, traveled up to Mississippi to see if it was their child for themselves. And upon arriving, you could imagine that their tension was otherworldly, as they were hoping and praying that it would be their little boy. So as they got there, Leslie Dunbar saw him and insisted that the boy was indeed her missing son. I mean, despite the child's unkempt appearance and apparent confusion, she recognized the distinct mole on his neck and the way he struggled to put on the shoes, just as Bobby did. The father, Percy Dunbar too, was convinced that this was their long-lost son. and the authorities were swayed by the Dunbars' emotional pleas, and they took the boy into custody and arrested William Walters of suspicion of kidnapping. Now, mind you, Walters, however, maintained his innocence, claiming that the boy was his nephew and that he had just been entrusted with the care while the child's mother, Julie Anderson, was gone. He argued that he had no connection to the Dunbar case and that the resemblance between Bruce and Bobby was just merely a coincidence. But despite his protest, Walters was put on trial for kidnapping, and the boy was returned to the Dunbar family. And as the trial started to unfold, the mother, Julia Anderson, now arrived in town, and she claimed that the boy was indeed her son, Bruce. I mean, she even provided witnesses who testified that Bruce had been in her custody at the time of Bobby's disappearance. But her testimony, for some strange reason, was largely disregarded. And then the court found William Walters guilty of kidnapping, and he was sentenced to life in prison. So the boy, now officially recognized as Bobby Dunbar, finally returned home with the Dunbars and began the process of readjusting to his old life. I mean, he was welcomed back with open arms by the community, and the story of his miraculous return made headlines nationwide. And Bobby from there, believe it or not, had a wonderful life because he grew up, he got married, and he had children of his own, never questioning his identity of the events that had shaped his early life. And at this point, decades have passed, and the Dunbar case had faded into history, becoming a local legend and a cautionary tale about the dangers of child abduction. And that's the end. Just kidding. Like I said before, you're going to want to stick around for this end. And if you like these stories so far, please make sure to give a thumbs up, hit that like button right now. It would truly mean a lot. Thank you. However, the story takes a crazy turn when almost 90 years later, in 2004, a shocking revelation came to light that would forever change the narrative of Bobby Dunbar's disappearance. And this is because Margaret Dunbar Cutright, who was Bobby Dunbar's granddaughter, began to, sleuth and investigate the case after hearing rumors that her grandfather might not be the real Bobby Dunbar. So she tracked down the descendants of William Walters and Julia Anderson and persuaded them to undergo this DNA testing. Remember Julie, the mother, saying, "Hey, that's my son," and the court saying, "No, it's not," and William, who had to go to jail for years because of this. Yeah, those two people. Well, guess what? The results were stunning. The boy, who had been raised in the place of Bobby Dunbar, was not biologically related to the Dunbar family at all. I mean, the implications were staggering. The child who had been found with William Walters was, in fact, Bruce Anderson, just as Walters had claimed all along. And the Dunbar family, who had celebrated the return of their son and built a life around his identity, well, their descendants were left reeling from this revelation. You see, the Dunbars, in their desperate desire to find their missing son, had convinced themselves that a totally different boy, Bruce Anderson, was indeed their Bobby, despite the evidence to the contrary. And William Walters, an innocent man, had spent years in prison for a crime that he did not commit. And Julia Anderson had been denied the right to raise her own child. And as for the real Bobby Dunbar, his disappearance remains a mystery, like I said, a ghost that haunts the edges of this tragic tale. Perhaps someday advances in forensic science or a long-buried clue will finally bring closure to his family and lay his memory to rest. Until then, this story just serves as a reminder of the fragility of life, the resilience of the human spirit, and the importance on never giving up hope, even in the face of unimaginable odds. And I told you gotta stay to the end of these stories because you never know what just might happen. And if you think this is crazy, well, then this one right here might totally shatter your mind. But I'll see you guys later. Cheers.